Hello, and welcome to the second installment of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation's conversation on balancing privacy and innovation in ARVR. Previously, we hosted an insightful discussion with legal and policy experts exploring the unique and exacerbated challenges to privacy that immersive technologies raise, and how to promote continued innovation while mitigating these risks. Today, I'm sitting down with Joan O'Hara, Senior Director of Public Policy at the XR Association. Due to technical difficulties, Joan was unable to participate in the panel, but she has kindly agreed to join us today to reflect on the conversation and discuss the ways in which XRA's members and other industry actors are approaching these tough questions. Thank you so much for joining me today, Joan.
Well, thank you so much for having me back. I'm thrilled to be here, and obviously was disappointed that I wasn't able to participate in the original program, but I'm very, very happy to be here and looking forward to the conversation.
Well, such are the trials and tribulations of virtual event holding, so thank you so much for joining us. So let's start with the same question that I asked all of the panelists in our last discussion. Why should ARVR be a part of the conversations around digital privacy today, even though it's still a fairly nascent technology?
Right. Well, I think, speaking in broader terms about privacy, I think in many respects, we're sort of at the threshold of a new privacy paradigm right now. In our digital age, where increasingly everything that we interact with has some sort of digital component to it, whether it's appliances in our home, talking to our car, socializing, entertainment, you name it, there's a digital aspect to it. And that's a very different paradigm than I think what was originally conceived when a lot of the privacy laws were first enacted. So this is a really important time for us to be getting ahead of these questions and really taking a step back and thinking about what privacy really means. It's tempting to try and apply laws that are already on the books, opinions that the Supreme Court has handed down to these new sets of circumstances. But in some respects, I think we're going to be banging a round peg into a square hole, or a square peg into a round hole, if we try and just make them fit. There are some new questions, particularly, I think, and we'll get into this, but with XR technology, because it combines a lot of information collection that, not all of it is particularly new, but the aggregate or the blend of personal information that's collected, I think raises new questions. So in terms of privacy, first and foremost, I think it's very positive that so many conversations are happening right now. And then in terms of XR specifically, meaning virtual reality, augmented reality, and mixed reality, you mentioned that it's still nascent in a lot of ways. And to me, it's like we're at this sweet spot right now, because the technology is developed enough that it is being used both personally by individuals for entertainment, for socializing, and at enterprise scale. It's being used in healthcare and manufacturing and public safety, etc., education. So it's out there, and it's mature enough that it's already having some really good benefits. But as you said, there's still a way to go, and it's still developing. So we have the opportunity now to get ahead of some of the policy challenges and try and have privacy by design be a part of the next phase of development for XR. So I think we're in a really good place right now where we have something substantial to talk about and to work with, but we're not fully there yet. So when we do sort of arrive, we can make sure that we've gotten it right.
Sorry,
yes.
Sydney, I was muted.
Yeah.
So what would this privacy by design look like? What should the companies that are building these technologies do now or in the relatively near future to mitigate some of these risks?
Well, I think, without going into necessarily technical recommendations, the most important thing is that we're examining the issue and having a really robust, honest conversation to identify what are the challenges, what challenges are unique, what challenges have been out there that will be a part of this conversation, but really taking a hard look at things and identifying what are the problems, what are the challenges, and what are the smart ways to go about addressing them. So, for example, just in terms of what industry is doing proactively, the XR Association, and we represent industry manufacturers, we've partnered recently with the Bipartisan Policy Center to do a year-long initiative looking at XR technology, both the promise and how we can ensure that it is responsibly developed and adopted, but also looking at the privacy challenges that are going to come up. And we're bringing together stakeholders across the entire spectrum. We will have industry representatives at the table. We'll also have academics, scientists, law and policymakers, representatives from civil society, and other influencers, all part of this same conversation, coming around the table together to take a hard look at this and see what are the challenges and how are we going to address them. We're hoping that out of this process will come some really smart, actionable recommendations for policymakers that will help inform the conversation.
So, like you're saying, and I think one of the main takeaways in our panel conversation is that there's a lot of really important questions out there, but very few concrete answers.
Right.
So I have to ask, do you think robust privacy protections can coexist with the vision that your members and industry leaders have for the future of immersive technology?
Absolutely, 100%. For example, virtual reality has to collect certain information, biometric information about the user in order to create the immersive experience. So if you've got an HMD on and you're in a virtual environment, it's important for the machine to track where you're looking, for example, whether it's your head movement or your eye gaze. When you look to the left in the virtual world, you want to see what's on the left. So the machine has to interact with your body in that way. But that doesn't mean that your privacy has to be violated. So I think it's imperative for all of us as potential consumers to make sure that our privacy is respected and protected. And industry does genuinely care about that. It's the right thing to do. We want to make sure, as I said, that the technology is developing responsibly. But, even from a quote unquote cynical standpoint, it's a good business model. No one's going to use this technology if they think that it's harmful to them in some way, or if it's collecting information that's so personal about them and then that's being sold without their knowledge. The trust factor is paramount. So it's important for us as consumers and as the panelists from the event when this first took place all highlighted, there are new questions, and it kind of fits into a human rights paradigm, thinking about what should we expect, what are our fundamental privacy rights, but from an industry perspective, in order to ensure that this technology reaches its potential, that it's ubiquitous, that it's out there, that it's doing good things for society, people have to trust the technology itself and also the people behind making it.
So looking deeper into some of these privacy concerns, have you come across certain industries or use cases where there are specific privacy concerns for that use? And if so, how are your members responding to some of those specific concerns or risks?
I think, sort of a good analog is healthcare. So, health information is obviously among the most personal. We have HIPAA to make sure that information is kept private and only shared with your consent and for certain circumstances and with certain individuals. There are similar concerns with XR technology, and it's a sort of a parenthetical point here, but this technology is a tool. So it's not inherently good or inherently bad. It's a tool, and it depends on how we choose to use it that makes it good. So, for example, with health issues, they're doing some research on HMDs that indicates the eye tracking in particular may be able to detect signs of dementia early. And we know that early detection is really critical to ensuring that someone is treated and has a good life. So that's a very positive application for this technology. On the other hand, the technology knowing before you know yourself that potentially you're at risk for something like dementia, if you don't know that information has been collected, then that's obviously not right in terms of privacy. So I think it's a balance of understanding what information is collected and why, and how that can be used for good, and making sure at the same time that the user is a full participant in the use of their information. And that brings us to the question of meaningful consent, which goes beyond just XR technology. I think that's a very, very critical point across the board in terms of the relationship between industry and users of technology and social media.
So you mentioned HIPAA, and one of the things that we talked about a lot in our panel conversation was the emerging state-level privacy bills that are coming up here in the US. So can you describe how these emerging laws and some other existing laws in the US might impact the development of XR technologies?
Absolutely. And it's been very interesting over the past several years to see the patchwork of state laws expanding. And there's some really good stuff in there. I think some of the basic considerations like meaningful consent, transparency, opt-in versus opt-out, these are very, very important issues that we need to address. But not all of them are exactly alike. There's, as your panel said the last time, there is some cut and paste going on among the state bills, but they're not identical. And it makes it difficult for industry to comply with sort of this quilt of various laws. So XRA is fully supportive of a federal law. It's time. Other countries have already adopted broad laws, and the U.S. arguably is a little bit behind on that. Now, I know it's a difficult topic, and it's not going to be easy for Congress to hash that out. But I'm encouraged to see, for example, Susan DelBene, who's the co-chair of the Reality Caucus on the Hill, just introduced a bill on privacy last week. So the conversation is happening early in this Congress, and I'm hopeful that we can make some progress, but the patchwork is difficult. It also potentially stifles innovation, which we don't want to do, because the cost of compliance with so many different laws can be high, and it is difficult. No one wants to run afoul of any law, but when there are dozens out there, it's, sometimes it takes an army of lawyers to sort of sort all of that out. So I think while the conversation is good and it's going in the right direction and it's a positive that lawmakers are taking action, I do think the downside is that there are a lot of different laws to comply with, and a federal law would serve everyone better.
So from our previous discussion with the panelists and a growing body of research in the field, it seems like user transparency and choice mechanisms, as you mentioned, are very important here, but also will require a different approach in ARVR than other two-dimensional media. So can you give us an idea of what developers are doing to translate these mechanisms into immersive experiences? And also on that, how can policymakers support more innovative approaches to privacy protections in these different mediums?
Right. I think, talk, for example, about being in a virtual world or a virtual environment. There are a lot of different questions. Sometimes it's just you in a virtual environment. I actually love to do nature walks with my HMD. I find it very relaxing, and it's like I've gone someplace else. But there are also games and social platforms where you're interacting with others. So it's a matter of protecting your individual privacy, but there are also conduct issues, how people behave in that space. And as your panelists spoke about, the experience in virtual reality feels very much like the real world, and in some cases it's even more impactful in some ways. So conduct and how people interact with each other in that space is hugely important. And augmented reality, and this is something that you wrote about in a recent paper, you have the issue of bystander privacy. So you might, as the wearer of the AR device, have consented to whatever, but someone walking down the street, or if you're out in the city and you're essentially taking pictures of everyone around you, do those people have the opportunity to consent? Should they? So again, I think we come back to the idea that there are a lot of unique questions, and the really important thing is that we're not only talking about it, but really actively trying to engage in a formal process to identify the issues and try and come up with recommendations. At XRA, we have published a series of what we call developers guides. They are intended to give guidance to developers in things like content, for example. How can they develop their products so that they are in the best interest of the user, that they take into account, for example, accessibility issues, how should they think about conduct, those sorts of questions. So XRA is trying to get ahead of a lot of this and provide guidance and bringing, as I said, stakeholders to the table. But these conversations have to be more than just talk. We have to make sure that we have something that's actionable going forward.
Absolutely. So to wrap up, this has been a great conversation, and thank you so much for taking the time to reflect on the conversation that we had previously with the other panelists. I'd like to close with the same questions that I asked everyone else earlier this month, which you've referenced, but I'd like to discuss in more detail. If the US does enact federal privacy legislation soon, what would you like to see included to protect privacy in ARVR? And what should policymakers consider to ensure that any federal privacy legislation doesn't overly limit or stifle ARVR innovation in this early phase?
Right. Well, I think taking the second question first, I think just the idea of having a federal privacy law would help in a lot of respects to promote innovation, because as I said before, when manufacturers and developers are trying to comply with this patchwork of laws, the transactional costs are a lot, and it's very different, or difficult rather. That level sort of uncertainty and compliance with various laws, that's something they really have to take into consideration. So a federal law, I think, just right off the bat would be helpful, because everybody would understand what the requirements are and everybody's sort of playing on the same playing field. So I think hopefully we can move the ball forward. As I said earlier, seeing an effort like Susan DelBene's bill coming out this early in the Congress, I think is a positive sign. And the first question was,
what should policymakers consider when enacting this legislation to make sure
Sorry.
it actually does protect privacy in these new technologies?
All right, thank you. Well, as we discussed, there is certain information that needs to be monitored and collected in order for these technologies to work. So to say that, you can't collect eye tracking information, for example, well, basically then you can't have a virtual reality experience. So there are different questions that are unique when it comes to XR technology. I think one of the most important questions that will help to sort of address everything is meaningful consent. And I know that that's at the center of a lot of conversations. It needs to be, like I said, a relationship of trust between the user and the developer or manufacturer. So even though this information is necessary to create these experiences, what's done with that information, your awareness of how it's used, who sees it, how long is it stored, is paramount. And, maybe it doesn't need to be something as black and white as opt in or opt out for the whole entire experience. Maybe it doesn't have to be a take it or leave it. If you want to be able to use the technology, maybe you can opt out of certain uses of your information while consenting to others. So all of that, it requires a lot more conversation than we have time for today. But I think that idea of not just consent, but meaningful consent and user choice is going to be central to all of this.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point, that underlying user trust is so critical to allow for innovation going forward. And I think you make a great point that our policies should foster that trust as well as innovation in the technology itself.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Joan. I'm so glad we were able to do this and have you come in. I'm sorry we had the difficulties the first time, but it's been great having you this time around.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate the opportunity to add to the conversation, and I look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. This has been great. If you haven't watched the first panel conversation, that is available at itif.org and on our YouTube page. So be sure to check that out as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.